So what do you identify more as, a filmmaker or an investigative journalist?
Well, for me, they're kind of the same, similar territory. You know, as a documentary filmmaker, you're looking for things that are you're investigating the world. That's my approach, really, is to look for stories that that are personal, but also tell this kind of bigger picture, have this bigger picture kind of relevance of things that are important, you know, right now in the kind of modern world.
Yeah, and this film kind of.
And by the way, to challenge authority a little bit, I think that's part of that's important to sort of stand up against sort of powerful forces. I mean, there's an element to journalism that really should be adversarial. That's when it gets most useful. You know, when it's questioning people that are abusing power or that are in power and not being responsible with that power.
Interesting, and that drives you as a filmmaker.
Yeah.
Those are the stories you go after.
Yeah.
Okay, so and this film is a great companion piece with We Are Legion. They're kind of in the same wheelhouse, but different films in other ways, because this is a much darker film, right?
Yeah, yeah. We Are Legion. I feel like this film is in the same general kind of sort of landscape as We Are Legion, the story of the hacktivists. I followed the kind of origins of the non-group Anonymous for a period of time, a year in which it really saw an unprecedented level of hacker and hacktivist activity, and frankly saw a huge level of protest around the world. I mean, the world was on fire that year.
Right.
You know, I was following activity that was the PayPal 14 when they had conducted denial of service attacks against MasterCard, Visa, and PayPal when those companies cut off financial services to WikiLeaks. But that was also the beginning of the Arab Spring. You know, Tunisia was touching off a matter of weeks later. Lulsec, the summer of lulls in the hacker community. But by the end of that year was the Occupy movement. So that film reflects some of the intensity and the anger and the frustration that was really expressing itself that year. But, you know, Time Magazine called it the year of the protester. Person of the year was the protester. And, you know, of course, the year after was the year of the crackdown. We've seen unprecedented crackdown on journalists, hackers, activists of all kind of whistleblowers, and this kind of overbearing kind of government assault on people, information activists, people looking for the truth of our world or the truth of our government. And so this is a story that comes out of that it's a darker time and it's a darker story, I think, as a result.
Yeah, I think it dovetails perfectly, those two films.
Yeah, thanks.
Into each other. And tell me about when Aaron died. What was your status? Were you weren't working on this film at all, right? No.
I was on a panel talking about my previous film with Quinn Norton, who's in the film, an ex-girlfriend of Aaron's. And the panel was in New York about a week after Aaron died. And everybody at this event seemed to know Aaron, and everybody was very, very sad. And everybody seemed to have a story about him. So I basically, you know, traveled with a camera. I started filming people right away within a week of his passing. And then I filmed at Cooper Union. I filmed the memorial that they were worried would have, you know, 100 people show up, and it turned out to pack the place. 700, 800 people showed up, standing room only. So it was at the very beginning of this period of this huge wave of anger and frustration that was that people were stepping forward, even the people that didn't know Aaron. And so I was compelled to try to understand both his story and why so many people connected with it.
And what's fascinating to me, because I'm kind of jumping around here, but I think from what we know about Aaron, he would be surprised that so many people connected with him, right?
Yeah. Quinn Norton, you know, his girlfriend for a long time, told me that they actually had a conversation at one point about what the internet would do if he died, if he was gone, and he said that probably nobody would notice, and her opinion was that it would be a big deal. People would really respond, and so I guess we found out the answer to that. I mean, it really was a kind of phenomenal outpouring of anger and frustration that came out of of his death, and a real directed both at the government, the prosecution that hounded him for 2 years, but also I think was inspired by his life.
And there's a tremendous amount of pressure for a young man to go through. And I think what you portray really beautifully in the film is how he is, in many ways, a young man.
Yeah.
The way he viewed the world. He was so pure.
Yeah.
His intent was pure. He looked like a younger than he was.
Yeah.
You know, and he had good intentions. And he didn't seem to... What I found was, in achieving all he achieved, it never seemed like it was... He worked very hard, but it never seemed like work to him. It seemed natural, like he was born to do this.
Yeah.
That's what he was meant to do. And only when the government got involved did he start to break a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, he was very young. He was participating in these internet communities from a very, very young age, and that's one of the kind of remarkable parts of the story. You know, I mean, he's really holding his own among some of these kind of internet luminaries, these kind of icons of the internet, Tim Berners-Lee and Lawrence Lessig and all that, and even in these kind of early working groups that are talking about things like RSS and working on the standards of RSS and how information is going to flow online. He's really holding his own and being a colleague, kind of combative, definitely making these kind of substantive kind of contributions to that world. And there's a funny part in the film where somebody says, you know, we'd really like to kind of meet you in person. We'd think, you want to come to one of these face-to-face meetings where we're all going to get together and talk about this stuff. And he says, I don't know if my mom would let me. I'm only 13 years old. And so they're like, you know, there's this eye-popping moment where it's like, wow, this guy that's been like, you know, driving some of these conversations is only 13. First of all, wow. Second of all, now we really want to meet him. So we talk about that in his early life. But he was kind of forged in those communities, I think. Part of the reason why, you know, I chose the title The Internet's Own Boy. But he takes a distinctive turn after they sell Reddit to Condé Nast, where it becomes about political organizing, and it expands way beyond the kind of internet world in which he was this kind of quasi-prodigy celebrity.
Right, and I love, by the way, speaking of that, I love that when he gets on that podium, you can't even see his face.
Yeah, there's a really funny part in the film where they as a part of Creative Commons, he's one of the technical architects of Creative Commons, so they ask him to come up and explain the technology part of it. So they're all taking turns and all this, and it wasn't until he actually gets on stage that they realize that, you know, this podium is almost bigger than he is, and he's just peeking out over the podium, and then suddenly, you know, he flips up his laptop and you can't even see him. So another one of those glimpses into his kind of who he was in that world at that time when he was very young.
Figures like him, these kind of really brilliant young people, or a lot of people that this country likes to label hackers, which is kind of this evil thing. Yeah. For me, he comes off as different because he's brilliant, but he's not intellectually intimidating. If you know, he's not trying to bully people with his intellect like other people.
Yeah, that's funny. That's funny that you mentioned that. I do think that at some of his, in his early kind of in some of his teenage years, he was a little bit of a kind of tech bully. I think that he rubbed people the wrong way. I think I think that he came across as like knowing everything, and not afraid to kind of tell you that he knew everything. A lot of people sort of describe that part of his personality. I think the real tricky part is that he was young, which I think, you know, most young men have that anyway. But it's also, he sort of did know everything. Like he kind of legitimately kind of could back up his points. So there's a little bit of that, but there's really a kind of humbleness to me that comes in later in life, where he's explaining things. It seems to me a real skill of his that he's able to explain things that are technologically complex in ways that are not just easy to understand, but in ways that really make you understand their relevance to your life. I mean, because ultimately, you know, we're moving beyond this time in which there is the internet's this realm of geeks and hackers, right? We're moving past that. We're now all online. Right. This is the place where we live. This isn't the realm of programmers or coders or aficionados somehow. You know, like quote unquote hackers. Like, this is where we live. So it's time for us to kind of understand this landscape, understand the kind of traditional values and stuff that we want to bring in terms of human rights and civil liberties, and how we want that to work in this new world, and just what kind of internet we want to have moving forward.
Yeah, he was brilliant, and you know, technologically, obviously, his achievements are unprecedented. But we learned later that his real gift was not in that arena. His real gift was to galvanize people and help people.
Yeah.
Right, and then we get into his persecution.
Yeah.
And I mean, it seems that gift, as an activist, seems to be the reason he would put so much pressure on it. Well, we don't know. That's the most compelling question of the whole ordeal: is why was he? You know.
Right. Yeah, I mean, he clearly took a turn away from the places in which he was the naturally most skilled in this sort of technical arena, to this place where he was pushing and challenging himself, and ultimately a place in which he found, he kind of thrived, which was this political organizing and grassroots organizing for social justice issues, and then later for actually back to kind of completing the circle back to internet freedom issues. But he does run afoul of the law with the JSTOR incident, and that begins a 2-year legal nightmare for him. And to your question, I mean, they said they were going to make an example out of him. This is what the prosecutor said to Aaron's father, that they needed a case for deterrence. And it's a really curious thing to say, because it immediately makes you ask the question, deterring what?
Right.
What were they trying to deter? If they're saying, if it's coming straight from them, from the government, that this was going to be a case for deterrence. I mean, look, I made a film with the guy. Most of what I think he was doing was social justice issues, was political organizing. So is that the behavior they're trying to deter? Or was it, quote-unquote, hacking? And if so, how do you look at this incident with JSTOR, which is essentially taking too many books out of the library, and come up with the kinds of intensity, the jail terms, the insistence that it would be a felony? How do you come up with that from what he did? So the notion that he was going to be made an example of brings up all kinds of actually very troubling questions.
It's quite troubling, and it circles back, I think, to that climate that was from a couple of years ago. It was just, like you said before, the world was on fire. Do you think that's where it came from? People were just so afraid.
Yeah, I mean, I think you can't separate Aaron's arrest from the time in which it happened, the kind of landscape that was happening at the time. The world was on fire. You know, that was, I mean, I think his arrest was somewhere close to when people were literally catching fire. The Arab Spring took off. Certainly lots of anxiety about WikiLeaks. They had released the Afghan war logs, the diplomatic cables. There was this pushback against MasterCard, Visa, and PayPal, the group now known as the PayPal 14, and they conducted denial of service attacks. This is all the kind of landscape. But I think that I think that you can't look at Aaron's story somehow separate from those events because they were happening at the same time. But I also think that you have to look at Aaron's story as separate from those events. I mean, a lot of things happen online, right? Some of it is real serious crime. Some of there's different ways of it's silly to sort of loop everything under the word hacker because it's too broad. You know, it encompasses too much activity. And the approach to this can't be some knee-jerk kind of cookie-cutter kind of approach to everything that somehow involves a computer. Obviously, there's a range of things that people do online. So, and you know, in this case, I think many people in the film make the case that this should have been left for MIT and JSTOR to deal with in some professional kind of way. I mean, maybe it deserves a slap on the wrist, but does it deserve a press release from the government saying 35 years in prison and a $1 million fine? I mean, it's obviously overbearing. It's obviously too much.
And that's what makes it so troubling, is suicide. It bothers me as it bothers everyone else. But I want to kind of switch gears here and talk about the filmmaking. in a film like this, where the subject matter is so politically sensitive, no documentarian, it's near impossible for a documentarian to create the exact movie he wants to create. You can't, in an ideal world, you'd get someone from MIT, someone from the government, and Aaron's family in a room is like, let's figure this out, guys.
You
can't do, that would be great, but that's not the reality. So you're kind of getting whatever you can get. You're going after what you can. Talk about that process and shaping the film around what you could acquire.
Well, we were lucky. I got most people that I want to talk to me about the film, and a lot of people I already knew from previous work, so I got a lot of sort of, I guess, inside access, quote unquote. But you're right to point out that in an ideal world, I would have gotten the government's point of view. I certainly try. It wasn't like for lack of trying.
What is that process like?
Well, you just harangue them, and they send you to somebody else, and then you try again, and then they send you to the press person, and they try again. So this went on for months and months and months, and I really got a kind of definitive no, like they weren't just going to do it, and they haven't talked to anybody about this case. But that's to their great shame. I mean, we should know what's going on with this case. This was 2 years of this prosecutors going after this kid for what exactly? Checking too many books out of the library, essentially. At the same time, we're in the middle of a financial meltdown. Our economy is crashing, and because of this sort of awful behavior of a handful of people, and nobody in the banking industry sees the inside of a courtroom. Meanwhile, it's this kid, 24, 25-year-old kid, that we have to insist is a felon. It definitely brings up a lot of questions, and I wanted the government's position. I would have talked to Steve Hyman. I would have put Steve Hyman's position, his case, in the film. I would have let him make the case, even put it, and I would have played it straight. I want to know what they were thinking. We don't know. There was never a public trial, right? We can't look at the transcripts and say, okay, this was their case. We can look at the indictment. We can look at the charges that were brought against him. We can look at the documents that we have. But since it never went to trial, and we talked to everybody, but since it never went to trial, we don't know specifically what they were going to argue. What was the real crime that warranted a felony here? And I wish we did. I think we kind of deserve to know. I mean, this is what our government is doing. We're spending money to go after a kid like this for 2 years. What is the purpose of this? Also, tell this kind of bigger picture, have this bigger picture kind of relevance of things that are important, right now in the kind of modern world.
Yeah, and this film kind of...
And by the way, challenge authority a little bit. I think that's part of that's important to sort of stand up against sort of power. As We Are Legion, the story of the hacktivists, I followed the kind of origins of the non-group Anonymous for a period of time, a year in which it really saw an unprecedented level of hacker and hacktivist activity, and frankly saw a huge level of protest around the world. I mean, the world was on fire that year, full forces. I mean, there's an element to journalism that really should be adversarial. That's when it gets most useful. When it's questioning people that are abusing power or that are in power and not being responsible with that power.
Interesting, and that drives you as a filmmaker. Yeah. Those are the stories you go after.
Yeah.
Okay, so. So what do you identify more as, a filmmaker or an investigative journalist?
Well, for me, they're kind of the same, similar territory. As a documentary filmmaker, you're looking for things that are you're investigating the world. That's my approach, really, is to look for stories that are personal. But
and this film is a great companion piece with We Are Legion. They're kind of in the same wheelhouse, but different films in other ways, because this is a much darker film, right?
Yeah. Yeah, We Are Legion, I feel like this film is in the same general kind of landscape